back to Eschatology Matters. I am Josh Howard, and I'm hosting today, joined by Tim Bushong. We have a special guest as well. But before we get over there, I want to remind you, we have several upcoming things for Eschatology Matters. We want to encourage you, if you have not already, check out the website, eschatologymatters.org, a sort of central hub for where we have all of our articles and video links, and also upcoming conference information. So if you did not see the conference information, September 8th and 9th, it will be in Topeka, Indiana. It's coming up quick. There are still tickets available, and I think there was also a deep promo code that was just shared online. So please check that out on the website. You can also check out our YouTube content as well as our audio content that's coming out, where you can find that on any podcast aggregator that you use. Be sure to like and subscribe to it to make sure you catch the content that continues to come out. But Tim, good to be back with you today, brother.
You too, Josh. Good to see you, and good to meet you, Peter.
Yeah, good to meet you guys too.
We haven't even introduced you yet, but it's very nice to meet you here.
It's all good.
Here in the virtual world of the worldwide interwebs.
Yeah, that's Peter, right. Would you mind leading in? Just give us a little introduction to you. I know we were chatting before, but this is our first time talking to you. So a little background on you and your ministry, and also how this chat today came about.
Yeah, so I'm currently stated supply at a RPCNA, Reformed Presbyterian Church in North America, in Ontario, California. Been kind of on and off with them and looking at other opportunities too. But graduated of Westminster Seminary, California in 22. But I'm on the older side of a West College graduate. I started when I was 29, so a few years after college. I was in the fitness industry for 7 years, professionally, did a lot of stuff and still kind of do that stuff. And then started this podcast with my friend who's not here. He's got a regular real person job, 9 to 5. So he can't make these interviews usually, but his name is Nick Fulweiler and he lives in Mission. I'm in Orange County, but yeah, we started this thing, Guild, Grace, Gratitude podcast. And funny enough, it actually kind of started through Eschatology, because he got really worried because his church that he was at in Orange County, I won't name them. They were very, 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 very hard on the pre-mill stuff. And so he was really worried, especially at the beginning of COVID. He was like, oh my gosh, the end of the world and the sign of the beast and everything. And so we got started on eschatology stuff, which was kind of fun. And then I think you guys first contacted us when we posted. It was either when we posted that we had, or we published that we had Daniel Hummel on. I can't remember which one it was. But we talked to him about the rise and fall of dispensationalism. And then we got a message from you guys like, hey, we had that guy on too, or we like that guy a lot. And I was like, oh, let's do something. So it's cool to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned, 2020 and how many people considered eschatology for some reason during those latter months of 2020. Yeah. Which in a lot of cases, I think it was probably a good development for us to kind of dig in and maybe grow some muscles that we didn't have. I'm thinking of the fitness industry still thing there in the background, obviously. But
sorry, keep that metaphor going. I'll continue with it. I'll keep going.
There we go. Yeah. So I did notice, and I didn't verify this story, but I saw on social media they were sharing video of a girl using her palm print through Amazon for a checkout line type thing. You put your palm over it, and I thought to myself, well, here we go again. Yeah. But yeah, so in general, where are you coming from? Well, where are you guys? I don't want to ask you to speak for your co-host since he's not there. But yeah, just in general, what have you guys or you discovered about eschatology? Where are you guys landing? And how can we start to frame the conversation a bit?
Yeah, so I started off at a PCUSA church. So I grew up a mainline PCUSA church. I don't recall anything eschatologically from that church. I didn't pay attention. I was a kid and I was not regenerate. And B, I don't know if they took us down on anywhere. I can't recall. But then I went to Biola University after that, or I went to Wheaton College for a year and then transferred to Biola University after that, which, if listeners know, that's like the kind of West Coast bastion of premillennial dispensationalism. And that was just like the context I kind of was trained in. But I never fully signed on to it. I couldn't make ends meet with the Old Testament and premillennial eschatology. It just didn't make sense. And it wasn't really until I just didn't hold a stance until Westminster, and I still really didn't hold a stance for my first year or so of Westminster. But Westminster, I don't think officially, but unofficially is amill. I don't think they actually like have a doctrinal stance for faculty, as far as I know. Somebody's listening may be able to correct me on that. But so I'm amill, and my co-host is amill. So that's more or less where we fall eschatologically. Both of us would admit we haven't put in probably nearly as much as people think we have eschatological thought. But a lot of mine comes from reading Gerhardus Voss and Meredith Klein and those guys. One of my professors was Riddlebarger. I saw you guys had him on the show.
We've had him
going to have him on
times.
the show. One of those two. Yeah.
Solid.
So a lot of people that I've talked to. Dr. Horton was a mentor of mine. R. Scott Clark was a mentor. I mean, they're all professors of mine, so I got to know them really well. So it was what I was most exposed to was the amill position. And we didn't really do we didn't do too much of like, what are all the various views and let's critique all these various views. I can't say it was a huge piece other than a few readings that we had. It was not as big of a deal. Maybe it was, I just didn't catch it. But that's where I'm at.
No, that's helpful. And I'm gonna pass the mic here to you here in a second. But Peter, I want to, number one, I was hoping to get you to kind of defend amillennialism in general. No, I'm just kidding. But maybe give us kind of an overview of what was it that drew you to that? Because, and I'll let Tim speak to this a little bit too, but one of the things that's been interesting, especially doing these Eschatology Matters chats, we're trying to encourage broadly reformed eschatological thought, right? So we're trying to look at whole Bible eschatology. We're trying to not just proof text and throw stones at one another, but instead to not only find where we can have agreement, but also where there is disagreement to make it clear and then to work through it as best we can collegially with one another. But one of the things with post-mill, amill conversations, it seems like a very in-house conversation.
Very much so.
We're all chopping the same tree. We've got the same axes. We're disagreeing a little bit how that tree is going to fall. Like what kind of ruckus is it going to make? I don't know if this is a good illustration or not.
How
but you know what I mean?
Like, going to be when it falls. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, we're all pretty close, right? We're
pretty darn close. That's true.
Yeah, I think the disconnect with, and I don't mean this as a slight, but with premillennialism, you're swinging either a different axe or aiming
it's a different axe. Yeah. I'll slight them for you. It's a different axe.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, it's a different setup. So, Tim, anything you wanted to speak to that?
Yeah, I just got given a really nice axe from a couple. I'm finished doing their Primera Council. It's a Fiskars, 36-inch, very light, and just
I saw you post that.
As efficient as it gets. Right. I was thinking about this today, and I called Josh. I have so many irons in the fire right now; it's ridiculous. And to be honest, the world of eschatology is I just assume it and go on because I'm an older guy. And I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. You know what I mean? However, I was wondering if at Westminster West, you guys went through a historical theology. In other words, how did we go from most of the Puritans being, we could even say either optimistically amill or post-mill, something of that nature, because they weren't pre-mill and they certainly weren't dispensationalists.
No.
And I'm just using them as a kind of a test group. How do we go from that to the bifurcation between amill and post-mill? Did you guys run through any of that stuff?
Again, this might be because I loved Westminster, but I think all of us, if we're honest, like we don't pay attention to everything that comes out of the teacher's mouth.
What?
Yeah. So that's shocker to those who are listening, but that's
especially to your professors.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sure my professors are really mad right now at me.
Yeah.
But that's, to be honest, I don't remember that much of them really going into, the eschatological changes. The only thing, so we dug pretty deep on Scottish covenanting of the 17th century. That's probably the closest we got to it. And that was our capstone church history class. It was the Reformation of Modern Church or something like that. So we talked about the Scottish covenanting, the Commonwealth a little bit. Whatever the document that ministers made with the church or with the Parliament of Scotland or whatever they're called. You can tell how much I know about this by me fumbling on it. So we talked about that a little bit, about the Puritans, not too much about where they fell, Amill, Postmill. We got more so into kind of Princetonian theology, like 1812 to like the founding of Westminster East, with Hodges, with Warfield, with Machen, and then how they received kind of the Reformed heritage, and then where that either split or kind of found a different expression in America. That's probably the closest we got to what you were talking about.
Okay,
So
and that. So go ahead, Tim. Sorry about that.
I was just gonna say, so not so much in that that era of the second generation Reformation, let's say the English, but then more.
We did talk about them, but the emphasis was less so. If we did talk about them, it was a little bit more on their ecclesiology or their sacramentology, a little less, and especially so with the Scottish Covenanters, we kind of hammered on sacramentology with the Covenanters,
right?
But less so their eschatological views.
And
we did, but not as much.
Yeah, the reason I go there, because everybody wants to go to their because as Josh said, we're all trying to be whole Bible Christians here. Sure. I mean, I'm a pastor. I can't have texts in the Bible that I go, well, hey, I just don't know, problem passages. But I think it's important that we know where we come from. And as one man said, we're Americans. We think Sears is old. Ooh, and it's just not so, So let's see. Westminster East was founded by Machen
in 29, yeah.
Machen in 29. And then Westminster West followed, obviously.
Yeah, 79.
79.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually newer than I thought. It's newer than Sears. So
it is newer than most things people think. Yeah. I think people think we're like Westminster East, which is still not even that new. Yeah, or not even that old, I mean. But yeah, we're relatively new. We're new kids on the block in a sense.
Which I think is really interesting, because that was founded at the kind of the tail end, or wherever you place it, in the fundamentalist modernist controversy.
Very much so.
And the PCUS, which became USA, they were befuddled by then. And we can't even go to Princeton anymore.
Yeah.
And yet there's no way that they would have been considered, at least today, the kind of fundamentalists that you're talking about in Southern Cal. I could take an educated guess as to what church you were part of. I spent quite a bit of time in Southern Cal.
Okay.
I visited the homeland, the original Calvary Chapel out there.
Yep. Yeah, that's not too far away from where I live.
A little bit of angel music in the background, and
that's right. I've never been there, but I know a ton of people have gone there.
Yeah. I knew folks that in my old rock and roll connections, we recorded in Los Alamitos.
Oh yeah.
And went to the Calvary Chapel in Cerritos.
Yep.
Which will actually Seal Bay. And to be honest, I was encouraged because my record producers were going to a church where it's verse by verse, right?
Yeah, totally. They're one of the few kind of big churches that actually do expositional preaching.
That's right. And yet, as a Calvinist, I know they don't like me. And as a non-premillennialist, they would have a lot of things.
They'd probably have more trouble with your non-premill than your Calvinism.
Yeah, and that's where I think when this YouTube channel started, Brandon, I'm pretty sure this is how it went down. I did a series. I got done with the Gospel of John, did a series in the summer of 21, Victory in Jesus, where I think for the first time, our friend Brandon had heard a non-normal Northern Indiana dispensational point of view. And he starts sharing it. Oh, you got to hear this guy. Well, I knew Brandon he was a guitar player, and I'd produced him when he was younger. So now he's a Christian, he's married, he's just newly minted Calvinist, and he's going, wait a minute. And then he decides to have a conference. I just love the energy that these young men expend. But it really wasn't anything radical. It's just kind of your bog standard post-mill thinking. And this will lead us to the next thing. Two of the guys in my church came up after one of the sermons and said, oh, I didn't realize you were Amill, because I had said that we were structurally so close to Amill that we believe right now the church age is the millennium. I wasn't taking
let me
that
jump in
future
there on
goal.
that one, Tim.
Yeah,
let me
yeah,
jump
yeah.
in there on that one because I want to talk about eschatology.
That too.
No,
We can edit
no.
that out.
Why would you want
So
to talk about eschatology? This is
yeah, I'm putting the focus back on you, Peter. So you were talking about Princeton, like Tim said.
Yeah.
I think this is a great on ramp, right?
Yep.
So you've got the Princeton crowd, which I think for a lot of Christians, it's just refreshing to look back through history and see that that the cultural milieu of eschatology that we've kind of grown up in, at least in our century, is not the dominant one throughout Christian history, and
not even close.
yeah, so I think that's encouraging for a lot of Christians. They read some of the older writings. Sometimes it gets a little tough. Like we were just talking earlier about some of the church fathers, and when you look at the early church and people want to neatly classify them as this or that, and then
good
make
luck.
broad sweeping. Yeah, it's not systematized. It's not precise language in the way that we're used to.
No, because it's not what they're dealing with at that time.
Right. And then you get into the original source. You'll hear something very confident. This guy stood on this. And then you read the original source material as best we have. And then you're like, well, that doesn't sound that it's nearly as clear as that description is. Yeah. Anyway, all that to say, you mentioned Princeton. So let's look at Princeton. You've got, you got the old Chuck Hodge. You got A.A. Hodge. You got B.B. Warfield coming from him. And then you kind of got that latter crop. So you got like the old guard. And then you've got kind of the latter crop. I'm thinking of, obviously most of us are familiar with Gerhardus Voss and some of those that flowed after that. You have described yourself in the Amill camp, and I'm curious because when I read those guys, again, they're writing in a specific time with specific interests, so they're not maybe as clear on certain things eschatologically as we'd like. And yet at the same time, when I read those guys, especially B.B. Warfield, I find a lot to link arms with on that. What's your understanding of, I guess I could ask you this way: what makes you identify as Amill with kind of those figures and that history in mind? Where are you seeing some of those differences play out to such an extent that you'd say, I think I'm in the Amill camp on those things?
Yeah, it wasn't until because I know Warfield gets played on both Amill and Postmill because he has some sections that are Postmill adjacent and some sections that are Amill adjacent, whatever it may be. But I think he's using, like you said, slightly different categories, different cultural moment. It wasn't until Pauline eschatology and the eschatology of the Old Testament. To one, eschatology of the Old Testament is a lesser known work from Voss. I think people are less familiar with that. Pauline eschatology, probably more familiar, but it's a tougher text.
Right.
Those were the clinchers for me for Amill. His understanding of the ages, of the upper and lower register, of his understanding of Peter's sermons and Acts, where he pulls from the Old Testament, how he pulls from the prophets, the latter prophets specifically, with the latter days, Kingdom of God. He's also got one on the, what's this called? I think I'd have to look this up, but it has Kingdom of God in the title, and I think it's his shortest book. But also one that talks about the kingdom and the millennium, and those are probably the clinchers for me for Amill to say, like, yeah, I think I can stamp my name on this.
Okay, so you're the person in the pew. I'm hearing you say this because, again, a lot of our channel is, we're trying to distill eschatological thought down to the lay level, or to the palatable level for people who aren't doing this every day. Kind of like Tim described. They're busy, they got a bunch of different things going on. So what exactly is it about? You mentioned kingdom. You mentioned two-age model, for example. I think that's probably the primary thing people would know of Voss is the two-age model. What is it specifically you're describing there?
So when specifically the sermons in the book of Acts, both from Peter and from Paul, and then somewhat, and this is also kind of a more, I guess, contested, what Jesus says on the Mount of Olives, and then after the Mount of Olives, how they use prophetic language when the prophets will talk about in the latter days this stuff will come, or persecution, whatever it may be. Because I think what people think is we hitch our wagons on Revelation. We hitch our wagons specifically on Revelation 20 with the millennium not being a physical, like you guys said, 1,000 year, but a spiritual reign of sorts. And like there's quibble about that, of course. But that's where, like, for average church member, it's like, how do we understand what Peter and Paul, how they use the prophets' language of in the days to come, in the latter days, the Messiah will come, or whatever it may be, or this is where the kingdom will manifest. That's probably maybe the pinpoint of where we see Amil language.
Yeah, and I think if you're looking back, I mean, if somebody's, for example, if somebody's interested, Introduction to Voss, probably the easiest on ramp would be the biblical theology.
Yeah, although it's probably the hardest work.
It's probably the easiest. It's like the
easiest
comprehensive
on-ramp,
view,
yeah.
right? Like it gives you kind of the footing from which to see
That's true. Yeah, it gives you kind of a holistic Voss thought versus just kind of separate stuff. But it is. I'm going to warn people. It is that's a rough.
Yeah, we can preface it by
read.
saying like nothing Voss wrote is going to be easy, right? None of it's easy. Okay,
no,
he's not writing. His goal is not like ours at going to the lay level with this stuff.
Oh no, it is seminarians. It is those who are working towards the church or PhD, whatever it may be.
Sure, yeah, but you got like the Pauline eschatology, and what you mentioned about it was one of the things I found so just groundbreaking about it was just his conception of. I mean, essentially, by the time you get to the Revelation, you should have been taught eschatology. Like you should have been learning this. I would say in the Gospels, that's been some of my primary focus, but also he's focusing on the Pauline epistles.
It's not relegated to the 66th book of the Bible.
Right. Yeah. This is something flowing through that by the time you get to that confusing portion of Revelation, like there's a lot of symbolism, imagery, but like, okay, I've got my grounding at least. So I think that's helpful. What's interesting to me, and this has been a lot of Tim and I's discussions over the months, probably over the years at some point. And this has been a lot of the questions that come in is like, what exactly though cuts an amil from a postmill on these issues? Because for a lot of what you just said, including Voss, a lot of postmills are saying, I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
And even with the two-age model, like for example, I have always found the two-age model very compelling, this age and the age to come. I can also recognize that there's references to a Jewish age, and I don't think many amils would disagree with that. There's a lot of post.
No, there's a little bit of a camp. Yeah, there's the Riddlebarger versus Horton camp on how the Jews are branched back in, or if they're already part of the church.
Okay,
Romans 11 stuff. Yeah.
So you've got that, but in general, you can look at some form of two-age model, probably across both, across amil and post. Maybe a little more of a stress on the 70 AD turnover as opposed to the death and resurrection turnover. You've got a lot of continuity there. What is it exactly? So like I'm hearing you, and I'm hearing Voss, and I'm hearing all that, and I'm with you, and I see B.B. Warfield a lot in this conversation, right? Kind of pulled in both camps. What is it about the amil view? Because specifically, one of the things I'll just lead in this way. I don't want to be deceptive with what I'm trying to set up here.
I feel like I know what's coming up next.
Yeah, it's the spiritual dynamic, right? Like this is where essentially a lot of these conversations are going to come to is what exactly is that spiritual dynamic? Because I think for many of us, we'd say, of course, it's spiritual. Like I don't know anyone that's denying that, and I try to read and listen a lot. So we're all recognizing it is spiritual, but then some of us are saying it's not just spiritual. Can you talk a little bit about that one? Like lead me into where you're thinking on that?
Yeah. Are you talking about the spiritual reign, or what are you talking about specifically?
Yeah, so as far as, between and post, we're united in the fact that we're all kind of under this big post umbrella. And I don't mean that in like I mean, as far as we all expect Christ to return post the millennial reign. The amillennial, post-millennial discussions, though, is kind of like an in-house, in my view, very in-house, like in-house and in the same room discussions of like, but what does that reign look like? So where is that reign manifest? Where is the kingdom established? And all of that's really, in my mind, getting down to this spiritual physical or sacred secular or heavenly earthly distinction.
Maybe a helpful kind of hat hanger, because I know amil will get split, especially on the reign, between kind of like pessimistic or optimistic amils, and the optimistic are closer to the post mills, especially towards the reign of Christ and kind of the gloriousness of the earth and how pervasive it becomes before. And not to say I don't hold a firm conviction of that, but I guess not experientially, but just seeing the through line from both Old and New Testaments, not so much of a when Christ comes back. I know this doesn't directly answer the question, but I feel like it's connected.
No, you're good.
Yeah, he's not coming to a for lack of a better way of saying it, like a Christianized world. He's coming back to us still like, it's been up and down throughout the ages, which is, I think, where amil tends to hang their cap versus maybe this is the Amill view or interpretation of postmill, as he comes back to a kind of a glorious kingdom that's already been made manifest on the earth in a more physical way than the Amill would see. It's more of the spiritual reign, where the consummation of Christ's reign is not before he comes back. It's when he comes back, he establishes the new creation, not like, hey guys, good job. This is you guys did the work. Hopefully that helps, because I think it's something Amills have a harder time of speaking about, the spiritual versus physicals. We can't really distinguish between both. We see the church as kind of the physical manifestation, the already not yet. It's here, but it's not yet consummated.
Yeah.
And that tension stays through redemptive history until Christ comes back the second time and takes in the fullness of his elects.
Let me give an observation and a little bit of pushback there, Peter, because that's super helpful. So like the one thing, this is my observation.
Yeah,
it's very interesting. You're talking about kind of that flow through redemptive history, and I think it's a really good way of looking at it. I think for a lot of us, you see Old Testament flow, and this is broad brushstrokes, but just stay with me. There's a spiritual and a physical component to the kingdom. And when I say physical component, I'm not talking about something as crass as like our hands. I'm talking about like there's society, there's laws, there's a kingdom, there's things you can look at, that sort of thing. Most of us would affirm that after Christ's return, that continues as well. Right. Yep. So like Christ returns and there is a spiritual and physical kingdom consummation. The push is like in the middle there has that changed? And again, I'm not trying to broad brushstroke that too much, but during this church period, church age, however you want to frame that, this interim between Christ's first and final coming, is this something in which that becomes a spiritual reality alone, or is there still a physical component? That's my observation. I think my pushback would be, and I don't want to mishear you on this one, Peter, because this is a friendly conversation, right? Like we're not.
Yeah, and I'm not the representative. This is my
no. Yeah, sure. No, I'm totally.
Well, I thought you were it. Oh.
Yeah, sorry to disappoint you guys. Yeah, I'm not the king of all mills.
Well,
no, you're.
That's Keith, and you know what? This means we have to talk to other guys.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, you got to talk. That's why all mills we can't put all the post mills in one camp, because that's not the. There's not just one view on some of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, let me plead with you on this one thing, and this is my bit of pushback here. So you mentioned, and I don't want to mishear you, but you were mentioning with Christ returning that I can't remember the way you phrased it, but essentially kind of the post-mill conception is that Christ returns and everything is good. Like we have brought this whole thing to bear. It's all good. It's established.
That's at least the conception that we have.
Okay. Yeah. And that's the thing, is that has been a predominant conception. I've heard that from, distinguished scholars, men who are much more, brilliant and well-established than I am, is that Christ just essentially waltzes down here and we've all got it taken care of. I would just say from there's probably that guy out there. And I think a lot of the golden age language, this is just Josh speaking, a lot of the golden age language in my mind paints that picture to maybe somebody not got.
I think that's what we see, and we make that connection.
Yeah, I get that. I have read as many post-mill and listened to as many post-mill authors and scholars as I can find, and I'm still doing so. I can't find that guy yet, because all of them are saying sin continues. It may be decreased, but it continues. Persecution, again, may decrease to a minimal level, but it continues. All of those things continue until Christ returns. And many, especially of the classic variety post-mills, and I'm thinking here back to like the Princetonians and that era, they're strongly affirming the fact that there's a satanic rebellion, a widespread satanic rebellion at the end. Of course, they're looking to Revelation 20 for that sort of evidence. So I would just say that's been a bit of the I don't know, maybe frustration, and not with you, obviously, but like, communicating.
You can lay it all on me. Just lay all your frustrations out on me.
I blame you for all the errors of the world. No, just trying to communicate that fairly and accurately, getting past that misconception, because I'm sure there's that guy out there and he's probably on Twitter, right? That's the way these things work these days. But that's unfortunate.
Twitter's not the paragon of academic debate?
I hope not, because we're in trouble if that's the case. But, but does that make sense what I'm getting at?
That does make sense. Yeah, and that's where I think sometimes, how do I say this? Because I know, again, I'm not the world's foremost scholar on either of them, but at least the impression I get is sometimes people want to make such a hard break between these two camps that they have to be saying completely opposite things, that Post-mill is just the glorious reign of the church, and it kind of dominates over all things. Sin is basically no more. All-mill is like, oh, we just kind of don't care, and it's whatever happens. If the government gets corrupt, then the government's corrupt, or whatever it is, and we're just gonna kind of hold back. And I think, again, with the social media stuff, these things get so radicalized that it does seem like there's a longer bridge to gap than I think that there really is.
Yeah, and I feel like there's been a lot of maybe bridge building or consensus. I mean, we had we've mentioned it several times. We had a chat with Keith Matheson several months back. That was kind of part of his hope, I think, is the way I could describe it, is that we're having a little bit of this consensus making within Reformed eschatology, and I pray that's the case. I think it's the outworking. If I'm shooting from the hip here a bit, but when I'm thinking of, like, you were describing people maybe missing each other's arguments, or maybe making a bigger hole or a bigger chasm between the two of us than there are. I think a lot of that comes out in the application thereof. So, like, whether Christ is returning to a predominantly triumphant and victorious church in this world versus whether Christ returns to redeem a victorious and yet shrinking in influence in this world church, the militant few that are holding out, that sort of thing. That sounds like not a huge chasm, but it starts to come in where, should we then expect those promises in Scripture to be fulfilled as we can see them? So, like, when Christ calls us to disciple the nations, should we expect that to happen? Should we be united in that effort? Should we be content maybe when that doesn't seem to be occurring? Those sort of things, and a lot of it, unfortunately, and I don't want to derail us, it also plays into some of those continuity issues with God's law, how we approach the nations as national entities, all of those sorts of things that get very tricky and very in the weeds. And yet, to me, that's what flows out of these conversations and causes some of the maybe the angst on both sides of the issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that does make sense. Yeah, I think that's maybe a more helpful way of describing this. Yeah, it's how does God's law, that you can call them two tables or moral, whatever it is, how does that apply to society? And then, what does he mean when he says disciple the nations? Whose job is that? Where does the church play into that? How do all these things relate?
Yep. Yeah, and that's where, a lot of people will push back on this whole conversation and say, okay, so you got, let's just say, optimistic Amil, because if you're like, well, anyway, I don't want to say it. So let's just say optimistic Amil and kind of a moderate post-mill, classical post-mill, like there's, oh my word, there's sometimes indistinguishable, right? There's a lot of overlap there, but it really comes down to, for me, a lot of the compelling passages, and I've kind of floated some of these out on social media to varying degrees of receptance, but or reception rather. But when Christ teaches us to pray, "My kingdom come, my will be done on earth as it is in heaven," like, what does that mean? How do we flesh that out? And that's not inconsequential hair splitting for the Christian. No. That's really important. This is the prayer that Christ taught us to pray. So, like, what I understand of that prayer really, really matters. Or when he calls us, as I mentioned, in the Great Commission to go and disciple the nations, what does that look like? What is the content of our discipling? Who are these nations? That's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where I feel that these divisions between these camps that are very much in the same room at the same table holding hands on many issues, that's where some of the divide happens.
I think so. I think you're right.
Tim, what are your thoughts, brother?
Yeah, I was thinking that's a lot of good stuff right there. And frankly, I think that is where I think some of the nature grace confusion, dualism can take place. I taught a series a long time ago, and it was based on somebody else's stuff, but it was that Niebuhr model, how Christians interact with the world around them.
Yeah, the 5 model thing, I think.
Yeah.
Christ and culture.
And the one we kind of reject because it's based on unbelief. So, it's like Gerstner said, you got these 3 views of soteriology, and one of them doesn't believe at all. So we don't even deal with those guys. But one of the proponents of, I would say the side that I've stuck my flag into, he says that it really comes down to, and now we're talking about, and I'll be like Josh, I'm using broad brushstrokes here.
Totally.
In fact, big
I
roller.
love broad brush. Yeah, the broader the better.
Yeah. I'm still waiting for Voss for dummies. Francis Schaeffer is Kuiper for dummies. So.
It actually, so just to kind of wet your palate, it actually might be coming from one of our professors at Westminster.
Okay,
he's working on some stuff
that'd be cool
for lay people on Voss.
That'd
cool.
That'd be good. anyway, the guy was trying to make the case, and I know he's preaching more on it, but it really is that, is the stuff of creation even redeemable at all? You know, the Anabaptists said, no, it's evil it's all irredeemably evil. The Christ above says, well, it just needs supplemented. I think that the two kingdom model, it's like, well, it's kind of in paradox with one another. And then you got these crazy guys out here saying, oh no, it's stuff is good, and the goal is to go back to the garden through the gospel, through the successful Adam. What would you say to someone that would maybe push back a little bit on the more pessimistic end of amillennialism? Because, you know, when you were talking, I was thinking, okay, yeast in the dough, mustard seed, it seems like the whole thing's permeated. And yet at the same time, I'm a reasonable postmillennialist. I know there's going to be sin until, because of what happens at the end of 20, and hellfire from on high destroys all of Christ's enemies. Yeah. But how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I maybe like Josh had from me, maybe a little bit of pushback. So I am a two kingdom guy. I don't like the talk of radical two kingdom. I know that's anathema to a lot of people. I just think it's like, it has been, like we talked about with Amil, Postmill, it has been so radicalized from the Theonomy group. There's been so much chasm, and yes, there's some kind of major disagreements. But I do think there's some agreements in some places, but it's kind of like, how do you distinguish unless you have like huge distinguishing factors in them? And let me give you an example real quick.
Sure. Because I was thinking about this. I've just recently, and I'm not a Twitter hound. Josh, you can back me up. I'm not on there all the time or whatever. When I do, I get in, I get out. That's it. You know, bang.
That's good.
I
wish I was more like that.
Well, I'm a Twittiot, so.
I wish I was a Twittiot or an Exiot, whatever it's called now.
No, I'm an expert on Facebook. That's horrible.
Okay. I haven't been on Facebook in years. I have no idea.
I know. Everyone says their parents. So I was reading some quotes recently from Daryl Hart, from Michael Horton, and look, I don't know these guys, and I benefited greatly from especially Horton and the White Horse.
I think I know what you're about to say. I think I know which quotes these are.
Yeah, and here's my thought. I was like, okay, this really is an attempt to be as absolutely consistent with your view of a common kingdom as possible. Sure. Okay. And my thought is the Bible doesn't present that explicitly. What it does present is kingdom of light, kingdom of darkness.
Yep.
You're either in Christ, you're not in Christ. Well, I mean, as a two kingdom guy, how would you, what do you say to
yeah, I'd say same thing with Amil, Postmill camp. There's perspectives within two kingdom. And they're not all uniform. Yeah. So I think what people do with Postmill, people do with Amil, is they lump everybody together in one of these two camps, say everyone believes this, everyone believes that. When it's just not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And it's easy to go, well, some of your own poets have said, and just kind of blow everybody off. And that's not fair either. I think that as Josh was saying, you know, these are outworkings of some of the fundamental things you bring to the table in your view of where we live right now. So we both agree right now, this is the redemptive age. Christ is putting his enemies under his footstool, or is making his enemies a footstool for his feet. Our church just did a version of Psalm 110 that's being shared, and people are like, can we sing this? You know?
Yeah, we sing Psalm 110 at our church.
Hey, well, go on my...
We're psalm singers only. We sing this all the time.
Oh, that's right. You have the RP, or...
Yeah, we're of the truly elect over here. We're the TR group. Yep.
But not because you think electric guitars are worldly.
I do think they're worldly, yeah. So you should get rid of everything behind you.
Oh man, I knew it. I knew it. Well, all that to say, you know,
I'm just kidding. I don't think.
I know. I know.
I would not have what's behind me. I'm all about this stuff.
Is that what you use in communion too?
Oh, we use real wine. Yeah, we got a guy who teaches other people how to make wine, and so he supplies our church with communion wine, which is fantastic.
So that regulative principle, you believe that the church is the kingdom.
Yep.
Right, Westminster.
Mm-hmm.
I think the church is a humongous part of the kingdom and the jumping off point for kingdom exercises and all that stuff. How would you respond? Let's say, I mean, you're in California.
Yep.
You're right there. And in fact,
you're in the quote unquote godless state. Yep. I know.
Right.
I hear it all.
Right. So does the church you pastor, do you have?
I don't pastor. Yes. I want to make that. I'm a stated supply. So I'm not an ordained pastor.
Stated
yet.
supply. You know, I was thinking about that. Only Reformed people know what that is.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to, because I know people will listen. It's like, you're not a pastor yet. Because I know I'm not ordained. I'm not a pastor yet. I'm stated supply, working towards ordination. Yep.
Well, good. We'll pray for you, Peter. That's awesome, and it's a high calling. What if the local sheriff started forbidding Christians to meet? Would there be a lawful and biblical response to that command?
Of course. Yep.
Okay, because that you would see that as being a clear violation of the COVID. I mean,
yep.
Not the COVID. Sorry, because we were out there in 2020 when it just shut down. It was something else, you know.
Yep.
What if it was something that's not as explicit and yet a violation of God's law? If you know what I mean, because we would say Hebrews says meet together. Yep. He's saying we can't. We'll have to obey God rather than men. Would you attempt to change the law or whatever the local ordinance was that put that there in the first place?
That's a good question. I think this also hits on some of the stuff we're talking about too. And people may wonder, how is this connected with eschatology? But I do think I do think there's some inroads with eschatology, and especially so with kind of the two kingdom amillennial camp. And I think we get lumped in, like Josh was talking about, we get lumped in with saying, no, we don't do anything with the state. But we just say we're very specific. The church does not deal with the state. The people who make up the church deal with the state. So if we have officers or legislatures, do your thing. Like if you want to change the laws, absolutely change the laws. But we as the church aren't going to go call the government to go change the laws, if that makes sense.
Can I give a little question back on that one?
Yeah.
Okay, so because I was going to have you rapid fire answer a couple real quick questions, but that doesn't seem appropriate. Now, let me ask you this: Kingdom of God as a spiritual kingdom, that does not issue political or social decrees. Agree?
Depends on how you define it.
Yeah, the definition's tough. And let me say, allowing for definitional vagaries, just in general and whatever way you want to define it. Would you agree that again, I'm not trying to trap you here, that the kingdom of God is not issuing political or social decrees specifically? Or would you think, if you were going to define one of those, where would you push back on that one, Peter?
Yeah. So how do I put this? I know where Peter Leithart falls in this, and I've read his book. What is it called? On Earth as in Heaven. I forget what it was called. Yeah. It was published by Lexham 2 or 3 years ago. I think he's a postmill, right? I'm pretty sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I kind of saw what he was saying with the church as a political in the classic sense. We're not all political in the sense that we don't say anything. We are of a different political realm.
Okay, let me define what I meant, because this is actually, I'm not drawing from Leithart. I'm drawing from, I don't want to keep his name out of it. This is from a mutual friend of ours, who I greatly respect. But this was part of his definitional categories for amillennial thought. And I thought it was interesting because one of the arguments that I've heard, and again, lots of different flavors of two kingdom theology, but it's, I would say, inescapably related to your eschatology, I think. So if you're specifically with postmillennial thought, so if you were to look at the church and say, can the church as such say, we think that there ought to be social mores and rules and values, or even enacted in laws as social mores and values are inevitably done. We want those things, as the church as such, because they are God's values as such. In other words, not because we think these are good things for mankind, but because God has spoken and we want that honored in the social mores of our society and in the laws enacted thereof. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, to help me, are you talking about, or maybe this is kind of all the above, from the pulpit, like ecclesiastical assembly? What are you specifically talking about with the decrees?
Yeah, I'm certainly not talking about some sort of theocracy where the church is the state, right? I'm not trying to blend categories. We're all fans of Kuyper here, so we'll keep the spheres separate to the extent that they are biblically. But as far as the church, in whether it's from the pulpit or whether it's we're all in a prayer meeting, like however that's vocalized or brought to bear, the church saying there's something evil in our society and it's being enacted in laws, we as the church want to speak to that as the church. And we want that enshrined both in the mores and values of our society, but then reflected in the laws and statutes of our society as such, not because it's some vague generality of goodness, but specifically because it's something that's decreed by God in his word.
Yeah. I see what and this may be a letdown to people. So first and foremost, the church exists to proclaim the gospel. So these are not to say that they don't matter, but like tertiary matter. Of course they matter because we're still in this realm. We're still not glorified yet. So of course this stuff still matters. So first and foremost, towards proclaiming the gospel. And I think these things are related to the gospel message, the law and the gospel message. And I think, an all-male, two-kingdom person, me, I guess, interpreted perspective-wise, like I have no problem, like abortion's wrong. I mean, kind of a whole like LGBTQ plus issues that's wrong. Like there's stuff that like I can just call like this is immoral, this is against God's law. Where we, how do I say this? Where we cut the line is the church as church, according to our mission, is not the one called to engage with civil government doing this, but I think people will just stop there. And that's not where I stop. And I think that's not where a good, consistent 2K for we're saying we then, if you're a member of the church, like go for it. Please go change this stuff. But the church as the church does not, but the members of the church absolutely do.
And see, and Peter, I'm glad you walked me through that because honestly, this is a conversation again. I'm not trying
totally.
But like
that's the reason why I say is I think like we're talking about, it just gets cut at the church doesn't do it.
Yes.
And people assume that a two kingdom all-male guy has nothing to do. We don't say that. We just say the church as the church.
And that's why I said
call out the
as
stuff,
such,
the
right?
people
who
make up the church absolutely do it.
So Christians doing Christian things. So this is where to me, and I'm trying to draw for the listener because we've been going down a trail. I want to draw it back, and this is what I'm kind of seeing with that whole Amil post-mill talk. Is on the one hand, one of the straw men against postmillennial thought is you want to force religious beliefs on people without actual heart conversions, right? Again, that guy might be out there. I've never read him. Everybody is making a big deal about God must regenerate the fallen man. So we'll do that. On the other hand, they're saying, amillennial guys want to hang up their hat and not see anything Christian happen in this world. And like you said, I've not heard that from them. I'm sure they're out there. And they're probably on Twitter. But going back to but the difference is though, and this is where it hits home for the Christian between amillennial and postmillennial thought, is the church called to do those things. So when the Christian encounters Matthew 28, and we read that we're to disciple the nations and teach them to observe all that Christ has commanded us, does that include as the church's call, and this is me speculating, does that include as the church's call that we disciple nations to obey the decrees of God? Because that's where you're going to see a lot of that divide between the post and is we're looking at very primary passages, right? Like these are some of the marching orders of our church, and we're looking at how are we to go about those things. And it's going to be again, we're chopping the same tree, but it's going to be very different in the way that's working out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's like you were saying, both sides get radicalized. And so we assume the all-mills don't care and just like, we have our church life on Sundays, we don't do anything else. And then throughout the week, we're civil people and we don't really have any dealings with the church, which is not what, again, I can't say all mills and two kingdom guys, but I think the ones that I've been trained under, they would certainly, the guy who I've been most influenced by, at least two kingdom wise and all mill wise, is David VanDrunen, and he's a lawyer, or at least he's passed the bar in Illinois to be a lawyer. And so it's not like he doesn't care about the law and legislation, all that stuff.
Right.
But we just have a different interpretation of how that's done between the church and individual, and not even around the Great Commission. And we can talk about the Great Commission too. And also a phrase that you guys used about going back to the garden. We would quibble about going back to the garden. We'd say we're moving towards new creation, which is better than garden.
Oh, I would never say going back to the garden. I don't think Tim would either.
I actually used those words, but I was
he did use that. I just wanted to
okay.
I used
sure.
that phrase, but what I intended was that it's paradise restored.
Okay.
I'd say not paradise restored, paradise glorified. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's fallen now. It's obviously we live in a
and that
world
might just be like a semantics thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is, because we all acknowledge that the world we live in is full of hurt and pain and suffering, and there's a whole lot of people who don't know Christ, and a whole lot of people that seem to know about Christ but don't care. So let me ask you this. You say you're influenced a lot by David VanDrunen. I've met guys that came from Wesminster West. They just very high esteem. I have heard him say some things that were concerning to me, but that's probably because of my Francis Schaeffer background and all that stuff. We'll see. Would it be legitimate for me as an ordained pastor to travel to the State House in Indianapolis and publicly admonish the governor of the state of Indiana to make abortion completely illegal in the state of Indiana?
I think you're going to get a range of opinion on two
What's
Kingdom
your
Oil
opinion?
Guys. Yeah. So my opinion personally, and this is, I think people want to radicalize this, but I really don't. I have a really hard time because of the power that's in the pastoral office of, and not even around abortion, because I think that's kind of a clear-cut issue. But around other stuff, is I think it can go kind of broader than this stuff. And of course, I'm going to speak against abortion. I have no problem speaking against abortion.
At the State House, addressing the governor.
Yeah, I think I have no problem. Yeah,
okay.
Talking about abortion to the governor and saying, "Hey, this should be illegal."
As a representative of the church.
As a person, as a Christian,
No. That's not the question, though. That's the whole kicker here is as a Christian doing Christian things, or as a pastor, as a representative of the local church.
So I'll say the reason why I have a hard time with pastor as a local church, because I think, again, I have no problem with I have no problem with denying abortion access, no problem whatsoever. I just think it gets after that a little wider on liberty issues that I have. That's why, like, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to kind of dance around the issue, but I think a lot of pastors think we have kind of omniscience over all things. We're like we have all the tools, we know all the stuff, but we're specialists in the Bible, and that's what we should be. We should be proclaimers of the gospel, and it's easy to like kind of use the office to like say this is what you should believe as a Christian. And there are rooms like modesty issues that you can have kind of interpretation on that stuff.
But I agree with that. But we are talking about the slaughter of unborn babies.
Oh, yeah. And I have no problem, saying you should not slaughter babies for any reason whatsoever.
Right. So you would see a distinction between a pastor publicly denouncing, say, girls at a beach. How dare you address this immodestly? And a pastor, again, because I did this. I literally went to the State House and admonished them. Do you know how I started my whole address, though? Sang Psalm 100, the old 100th, as loud as I could. And it was pretty much a solo because none of the evangelicals knew the song. I was so sad.
They might not know the Psalms at all.
And you can guess what the opposition crowd looked like. It was all pagan, purple-haired, bedecked, And the reason I bring that up is because that's kind of sometimes where I would think, okay, why not church speak prophetically on areas that there is simply no question about it. And again, I'm in the SBC, so I've heard some of the 9 Marks arguments. Well, you don't know the strategy. They're going to allow it for a while so they can really get it later. And I'm like, well, okay, you should prove it, But doesn't the church have because I know premill guys that'll do this, and they don't even have any qualms at all. They're like, oh, this is this is it. I think I understand your point though, because there has been a history of the church speaking with great authority on issues that aren't explicit in the text. Is that kind of where you're?
And that's like, I want to be clear that there are clear biblical issues that we can absolutely stand, like you said, prophetically. And I mean, I would say from the pulpit, you can prophetically go against these. And that's where I think people think all mills and two kingdom people will say, well, like, no, we can't talk about cultural issues at all. It's just about the gospel. But like the gospel is countercultural in so many different ways. But you will get a range of opinion in the all mill two kingdom camp. And I'm not the only representative of this. And there will be some who say you can't. But I think the thing we do agree upon is it's not the primary mission of the church is to proclaim the gospel. It is not to influence legislatively civil governments, though individual Christians. And that's where I think a lot of the quibble comes in.
Right.
But
So
you'll have people
in other words,
camp.
It can never be less than the proclamation of the gospel of Christ.
Yeah, and that's where all mills and two kingdom people get afraid that because there's so stinking much cultural sin and cultural craziness out there, that will become the primary thing in the church versus proclaiming the gospel, which changes hearts and changes morals.
Yeah, and
I think that's where we see. That's where you can get a reaction from the all mill camp. Is like, hey, like I heard no gospel in that sermon whatsoever. All I heard is you did like declaiming against cultural sins. Absolutely, go for it. But man, like that better be attached to the gospel.
I agree. I agree 100%. The prophetic voice of the church can't just be law.
Yep.
Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery.
I think that's where you get a lot of pushback, and you'll see that in social media and stuff. And that's where post mills or anybody who's not two kingdom will look at two kingdom and like, oh, they can't talk about culture. I think that's because we tend to see what happens on this stuff. And it's like, where's the gospel in all this?
Well, and to be fair, there have been quite a few R2K guys who said weird stuff, and we went, "What?"
Yeah, there is. Yeah,
it happens.
Yeah. We're two kingdom guys. We're sinners just as much as anybody else, so we're gonna say stupid stuff every once in a while. There's no question.
I just did.
I don't try to. You will find nobody. I'm sure people don't defend like. My quote unquote tribe or group, we are not infallible, and we do stupid stuff, and we say stupid stuff that we shouldn't say.
Let me ask one more, because I know do you have time for another one?
Whatever you want to do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. I know we're running on a little bit long, but I'm game if you are. So this is one, and again, this is in the spirit of friendly conversation, everything like that, because we could keep running down that road, honestly, like for a little while.
No, this is good. I like this kind of conversation. This is good.
That's interesting. But this is one I wanted to sneak in, and it's not unrelated. It is the concomitant or the simultaneous growth of both evil and good in the world. So I've often heard this articulated, and I'm not just thinking of one author. This is from several amillennial authors who, again, I love and respect. And yet they'll speak of evil growing alongside good growing. And I was going to ask you just to kind of like weigh in. Let me know what your thoughts are on that. I'll put my cards on the table. That's a hard one for me to wrap my head around in any real sense. So like if we were to think of some, pagan country out in the wastes of the far corners of the world, and then we're summoning missionaries together to go and spread the gospel, and we're hearing reports back, and they say, yeah, it's been incredible, the church is exploding, men and women are being saved left and right, it's incredible, and it has gotten so much darker too. That would sound really weird. Like maybe if they were to say the forces of darkness are really mad at us, like the witch doctor in the town, they're really hacked off. Like I've heard those stories from missionaries quite frequently, right? Like the ones that are there that are of the forces of like very clearly against God, they get really mad when they start seeing the work of God in his kingdom. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about an actual increase in evil alongside an increase in good. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer. Okay. That's not to say, like, shoot, would I love to see good abound in this world before Christ? Like, heck yeah. I would love to see Christian morals, everything abound, and there's nothing more I think an all mill or like a Christian wouldn't want. I don't think that's just an all mill camp. That's everybody. Maybe it's just like, it's just hard to like quantify more good versus more evil. And even with the gospel going forth, us as Christians, and this is not to say we're evil, but like we're still going to sin throughout our lives. It's not like the good in our life is going to kind of increase above the evil in our life.
Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about too, because maybe this will help a little bit. I've struggled with this one. I have friends in both camps, right? Amill and Postmill. And I'm trying to be sensitive and not straw man. But there's a frequent kind of refrain from the Amill camp that they're being mischaracterized by a pessimistic eschatology versus an optimistic eschatology,
sure.
Or an eschatology of defeat versus an eschatology of victory. Those sort of things. This is, and I understand the pushback because we're all Christians. We all recognize Christ is going to be victorious in the end. So in that sense, we're all proclaiming victory. But like if you looked back and David goes out. Well, I mean, Israel against Ai. We were just, walking through this one in church. They go out, they go against a city, they get absolutely spanked on the battlefield. They lose a bunch of guys, and they run home crying. And they're like, "Lord, we got to repent." Was that a defeat? Well, yeah, it was clearly a defeat. Now, are they defeated in general, like in the grand redemptive historical sense? Well, no, they're God's people, and God will triumph. We all agree on that. But we're saying they lost, and they were going to keep losing that battle as long as they stayed on the field. I think that's what's difficult with this conversation sometimes, is because it seems like the pushback says, no, the church is victorious. We're just going to see evil increase and increase and increase. And I'm just saying, like, when we look around, will the church be tangibly in any way that's measurable, and I mean spiritually even, victorious in this world? I think it's a fair line to draw, and I'm just curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah. I think the only thing I can think of is that's going to wax and wane. At least for my understanding, it's going to wax and wane throughout history. I mean, you'll see. I mean, like I've seen maybe more experientially post-mill thought kind of tick up since COVID. Some of these things, I think, they respond to whatever's going on in culture, and this is us in America versus those who are in China, those who are in Russia, those who are in persecuted countries. And this is not to me to say like I'm not proud to be an American. I'm totally proud to be an American, but I tend to think we like just have such a focus on American eschatology that we forget about our brothers and sisters across the sea, where they're like, if you're in a persecuted country, like absolutely you want good to triumph over evil because you're being killed and your friends are being killed and your family is being killed. You would love if God's love and the gospel abound and the church is triumphant over evil. You would love that stuff. And if you're in America and maybe post World War II, like 40s till, I don't know, 80s or 90s, maybe a little bit after the sexual revolution, you are kind of within the dominant group and you're like, Christian values did abound.
Except in the universities, the pagans absolutely took over the seat of learning. I was just thinking about this. I don't mean
totally.
I do mean to interrupt because I'm interrupting. But between the, we bombed all of our competition out of existence and then helped them rebuild. Yep. I mean, we're America. We're not completely bad, right? Yeah. But during that time period, there was a general, while you saw these big revivalists, and we're all reformed here, we would look at that and say, what, every Sunday's going to be Moody Sankey or, Billy Graham or whatever.
Yeah.
But boy, we just took the hands off. And I remember Francis Schaeffer saying, I think this is one of his public addresses where it's, probably on cassette somewhere. But he said, I think I have a right to ask, where were the Christian attorneys? Where were the Christian scientists, the biologists during that time period? Because we were, as you just said, we were kind of the ascendant group. And now that's being used against us now. So, well, you had your fun. Now it's the pagans' turn, and we're going to kick your butts.
I think even back then, and like caveat, I wasn't alive, so I don't know this. I don't know this experientially, just through reading and some videos, I guess. Take this with a grain of salt. But I do think even with the rise of kind of liberal thought within the universities, post World War II, you could say, yes, it existed pre-World War II, but I don't think it was as big. But I think it was recognized as such. There was the culture recognized the difference. And if you could if you could say, like kind of conservative values did dominate. Yes, there was, of course, liberal values within the university, but I do think, in a sense, it was like, well, that stuff's weird. It still existed, but it was weird at that time still. And now it's more like that is the norm, and everything else is not so the norm. And that's where I think I'm just maybe not I'm just not stoked with the optimistic pessimistic amil labels. I do think that just so changes with where you are culturally.
Can I suggest one thing, Peter?
Yeah, go for it.
Because I think this might be a little bit of, I don't know if this is pushback or not, but like because I agree with you. Like, number one, oftentimes all of our theological views, but especially maybe eschatology, are kind of like formed by where we are. You know, we look around and it's the world we see and the culture we're in, that sort of thing. So I think that's a fair critique. But also we're talking about trajectory, right? So like if you were to think of like a roller coaster going up the hill, and it's got the hills and the valleys, and it's climbing and then it's descending and all those sort of things. But we're talking about, like, is it moving upward or is it moving downward in general? So like we right now in the West, we find ourselves having been on a hill, and it looks like it, at least in my estimation, maybe we're in a descent, maybe a rapid descent. We can still look to other places where people have been in far deeper valleys than we are. You mentioned some persecuted countries, and that's fair to note. But at the same time, we're not talking about those. I'm thinking toward, like, if God is pleased to give me grandchildren, or even when I'm discipling my children, what sort of story am I telling them? And I'm not saying that one has to be wrong because it's not as rosy sounding, but am I saying God is accomplishing something that's going to have hills and valleys, but it's really kind of a descending slope where the church is going to be more and more persecuted toward the end? We should be okay with that. We're going to rally the troops. God's going to save us. That sort of story. Or can I walk them through scripture and show them that it is, again, hills and valleys? You may be in a hill or a valley, but it's a trajectory that is going upward, and we can see that throughout scripture, but we can also see promises that tell us that is the course of things. Would that be a fair pushback on that? Because I'm agreeing with you that, like, sometimes we find ourselves descending, but that's not, I hope, a momentary descent of 20, 30, 40 years. I hope no Christian is anchoring their biblical hope based on that, but I assume we probably are more than I think.
Yeah. And I think this is where I think all of our critiques will go on the pre-mill camp, is you have the Bible in one hand, a newspaper in the other hand. And I think even all mills and post mills will relatively do the same thing. We'll have the Bible in one hand, a newspaper in the other hand, and say cultural ills are this. We got to kind of push back. We're pessimistic right now. We got to be optimistic for the future because these cultural things are coming in. Or even like the ups, like that's still a relatively cultural thing, and you can see in the Bible, you cannot see in the Bible. I'm not quibbling against that. I have a hard time looking at the Bible and seeing either is persecution going to increase, or is persecution going to, I can still see that hill going up and down throughout history. I couldn't tell you if I think the Bible, I just don't think the Bible, for me, the Bible is not clear that it's going to be this consistent upswing of a hill. It'll be that undulating, but that's when I don't have children. I've been married for 6 years. We haven't been blessed with children yet. But if I were to talk to kids, and again, this is not me with experience, but I would put my hope and trust in them and say, hey, the gospel is going to win out. Do I think that means persecution is going to increase or decrease? I hope it's going to decrease. I hope it decreases. Do I know that for sure? No, because like Satan is on a rein. He's on a leash. I just preached through John 13, 1-30, which is when Christ gives the morsel of bread, dips it, and gives to Judas when Satan, he gives Satan an opportunity to go enter into Judas and to crucify him when he resurrects. But like, he's got Satan on a leash. So it's not like when persecution increases, that means he's losing. That just means for that time being, he's not his ruler, but God has allowed this to affect the church for his glorious purposes, whatever those may be. That's why I'm not huge on the pessimistic, optimistic, and maybe just I haven't read enough of this stuff.
No, and that's fair not to let that just kind of be like a pejorative label, and I don't mean it as such. I hope you didn't take it as such. But you brought up Satan, and so I'll feel free to just jump on that just for a second. Yeah. But that to me would be a good question then, is if Christ says there's an evil ruler, he's been prowling all around this place. He used to march into heaven and accuse Job, and there he is pointing at Joshua. But now he's defeated. Now he's cast out. And I know we're all in agreement here. Again, this is an in-house, in-room conversation. So Satan's not only been cast down, he's been bound up. Christ said, I tied him up, I took his house, and now I'm doing what I want to with it. It was always my house, but he was squatting. But now he's tied up, and I'm going to set things right. I think it would be a good conversation to have. And again, we're totally running out of time today. But if we were to have more time to talk at some point in the future, I think it'd be a good question. Should you expect results from that? In other words, if Christ has restrained that evil old serpent, and he's taken his house and he's setting it in order, can we expect that house to look more and more like Christ's house and not the serpent's house?
If I can just provide a quick little answer, and this is in a general broad brush, the Amil, we would say absolutely that still has results with the gospel going forth to the nations, the church proclaiming the gospel, the church proclaiming that Christ is victory over the grave. That will increase, I think, because people are going to increase. That's like the gospel message is still going to increase. We just don't think that has anything to do with persecution. Satan still has a foothold in this world, and he's still going to persecute the church, whether that increases or decreases. That's not in an inverse or proverse or whatever relationship to the gospel going forth. That is because
that's getting back though to the whole light dark increasing alongside one another, right? So like to me, and I mean,
if anything, when the gospel goes out further, we think persecution goes up.
And to an extent, I would agree with you, right? Like as the light shines, the dark, we're told, hates the light.
John 1:5,
so its deeds are evil. I agree with you there. This is, and I apologize, I didn't mean to walk on top of you there a second ago, but
no, go for it.
But if we're talking about the house, though, going back to that old illustration. So Christ ties up the strong man, and he's setting the house in order, and there's dirty bits to the house. So it can't just be a numerical growth thing, because that would just mean like, well, the house gets bigger. And so Christ is tidying up, but the house is actually growing, which means the dark, untidy bits are growing alongside the rest of the house. That's where I struggle with that analogy sometimes, because that doesn't seem to fit the illustration.
And it's not like demons increase in size, but it's the more vibrant or like have more progeny. I don't know. It's not too dissimilar for when Christ was on earth. Like you all of a sudden saw a lot more demon possession when Christ was proclaiming the gospel. And not to say you didn't, because we don't have recorded history for 300 years between the end of the Old Testament beginning of the New Testament. But you just don't. Of course, you see evil and darkness in the Old Testament, but you don't tend to see all that much demon possession in the Old Testament. But you do with Christ's incarnation. You just see a ton of demon possession. And then you see the crowd, people like, what is going on here? We've never seen this stuff. We can't find this guy. That's where not my pushback, but it did increase with Christ, and you would think it would decrease with Christ.
Oh no, and I'm agreeing with you. I think the difference we could draw would maybe be what I hear you saying is like the level of their opposition. So like, because I agree with you, like there's demons popping out. They're walking to a village, and it just mentions, by the way, they cast out some demons on their way there. So it's like it's everywhere, right?
It's everywhere.
But the level of their fighting to me is not indicative of their prominence in this world.
No, not at all.
Or they're holding sway. And that would be my only pushback is if we have a picture wherein light is expanding and the darkness is fighting harder, I'm on board with that. If it's a picture of the light growing and the darkness growing in size and in influence, that's where my pushback would be.
And I think you would get a pretty hearty amen from Amils on that. And I think that's where maybe Amils get misunderstood, is we're not saying that evil is going to increase. It's just going to get harsher.
Could I suggest some do?
The what?
Could I suggest some do pretty clearly? That and again, I say that not to argue, but that's been one of my struggles working through this. Is some amillennials are very clear on this, that evil must continue to increase in size and in influence before the end, and that's where I'm kind of pushing in on, because I don't think I'm arguing with you as much here as some friends that I'm thinking of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's where I think you get some reactionary stuff on both sides. The Amils react against Postmills, and Postmills react against Amils.
Fair.
And it tends to be less of a biblically saturated discussion than a I heard this came from your camp. Let me respond to this thing that I heard that came from your camp.
That was one of the first sermons I heard from an Amil perspective, and it was at the time I was still equating, dispensational premillennialism with literal interpretation of the Bible. I'm still in that camp.
Yep.
The guy basically said, well, what you're going to see throughout the rest of history is salvo, 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 boom, boom, all the way up until Christ returns. And so, thinking about that from rather, I think what Josh was getting at earlier is that we would see it more as a slow but steady increase with hiccups on the way, if I could illustrate it that way. Sure. If you're going to, if you put it on a graph, where it's not an equal growth of the kingdom of darkness, but rather the more the kingdom of light expands, the more angry they become, the more desperate, just like a cornered animal will lash out, even though it's doomed. Just like Nazi Germany, after D-Day, it was about a year of hard slogging before they finally surrendered. And it seemed like at different times in that, at the end of the war, that they might even win. Battle of the Bulge was that was shocking to the American generals at the time, and yet the push was inexorable. And I think everyone's a creature of their time, and we'll look back. And I think school children in 2070 will look back on our time as, do you remember when the ladies thought they could be men and men could be ladies? Remember how crazy those people were? But they'll also look, I think they'll also look back and say, can you believe that there were Christians who didn't want Jesus to be considered Lord of America or whatever? You know what I'm saying? I think some of this obviously flows from whether we believe that the gospel is going to succeed in discipling the nations in the sense of nations obeying everything Jesus commanded, which of course we would say it goes back to all the Bible. But anyway, just my insertion there.
Totally.
Now, Peter, we've been going a while, so I don't want to keep you held up all day. But this is fun, man, and I would love to talk more because it's helpful, and I hope it's helpful to those who are listening.
I hope so too.
As I said, this is not just me placating anybody. Like we're at the same table here.
We are. Yeah.
We're so close. And we're just trying to understand the Bible better. And sometimes, like you said, like you brought up several times, we don't want to talk past one another. We don't want to, straw man one another. But we do want the differences. If there's a difference, let's make it clear. Let's make sure we understand the other side.
Oh, I think people definitely know the difference between our camps. Yeah, but that's like you were saying. Gosh, we spend so stinking much time arguing with each other, and there's a world out there to go evangelize.
Fair enough.
And I think we get, rightfully so, we get stuck in these debates, and we should debate because, like, I guess there is a right and wrong in this. Not I guess there is a right and wrong in this, and we'll know in glory.
It could devolve into how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Yeah, that's what I like. I so stinking fear that stuff, and we spend so much time on social media bashing each other. And you're like, that's great that we're talking about this, but like, what about your neighbor? Like, are you talking to your neighbor about the gospel? We know our neighbors super well. I'm not saying I'm like the guy to emulate on this stuff. But yeah, like you said, Josh, this is it's an in-house debate. Keep debating it, keep sharpening each other, because this goes back to the word. But like, maybe I'm just a simple dude. I'm like, I love the gospel and I want the gospel to be known. And if the gospel were known by everybody on the planet, like, praise God. But that's
the eschatology
not for me to figure out. That's for the Lord to figure out.
For sure. I think the eschatology should, if it's not putting fire to your feet, then yeah, there's something wrong with it, right? Like, this should be something that makes us love God and then proclaim him more. This is, if we find ourselves in an armchair, smoking our pipe and talking nothing but debates with brothers, whatever it is, whether it's eschatology,
yeah,
totally.
Not good.
Yeah. You mentioned social media. Where are you at, brother? Where can people keep up with you? Are you on X? Is it X now?
Yeah. So I personally, I'm not on social media. I won't have any social media. That's not like a moral thing. I can't do it. But our podcast has it. So Guilt Grace Pod. My co-host has a social media, and our Fully. I think that's his tag. But we're on Instagram. We're on Twitter. X. I can't call it X. It's Twitter.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
we're on Twitter, and I think we're on Facebook. We don't do anything on Facebook, and we're on YouTube. And I think our tag on YouTube is Guilt Grace Pod. So yeah, if people want to find us, we're there. But if you see a post on those, it's probably me, but I don't make it known that it's me.
Perfect. Yep, I just looked it up. It is Guilt Grace Pod. So check that out. And I think we're cross posting this little chat.
Yep.
But I would love to follow up sometime, Peter. Maybe
Absolutely.
we can.
Yeah, this has been good.
Yeah, maybe we can rope your co-host in, and we'll all be talking on top of one another. That'd be great.
This will be fun. Yeah, I wish more conversations went like this, where we can gather around the gospel and talk about the gospel and the implications it has for church, for society, for all this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me go ahead and wrap it up. Josh Howard with my co-host Tim Bushong. Want to thank Peter and check out Guilt Grace Pod and listen to some of their podcasts. But Peter, thanks so much for joining us today, brother.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for inviting me, and yeah, it's a pleasure to do this, and we'll see how it does.
Seated here at my right